Good afternoon. My name is Peter Smith and I'm an Indigenous psychologist living and working on country, the country of my people, the Kamilaroi, in northwest New South Wales. And the topic of my presentation today is Cultural Competence to Responsiveness, a conceptual model for mental health practitioners working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And as we get started, I would just like to make an acknowledgement of country, and it's acknowledged that we all live and work on the traditional lands of Australia's First Nations people. We respectfully acknowledge those people and elders past, present and emerging. We also acknowledge those colleagues with us today who are Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people. So over 10 years ago, I set out delivering cultural competence workshops for mental health professionals on behalf of the Australian Indigenous Psychologists Association, AIPA. In that time, I came to see how important it is to ensure that we all provide mental health services that are culturally safe and that ensure that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are not alienated. I found out from local people and from reading peer-reviewed literature that many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people find mainstream health and mental health services culturally unsafe and therefore tend to avoid them. From this starting point, I knew that researching cultural competence was an urgent priority. What I want to present to you today is a model of what takes us beyond cultural competence to what is best described as cultural responsiveness. My PhD study at University of New England has been about exploring this concept of cultural responsiveness and how it can become part of best practice for mental health professionals working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients. The Australian Psychology Accreditation Council, APAC, now requires that cultural responsiveness feature within all stages of study at university, and the Psychology Board of Australia has also made cultural responsiveness a mandatory requirement for professional registration and has included this in its national examination. So what we are focusing on today has relevance to everyone within our discipline who has a role in psychology education and the supervision of those aspiring to be psychologists. So cultural competence as a defining concept has been in usage for a few decades now. But as you can see from these definitions by Wells and Sue, the meaning reflects the attainment of skills and the application of relevant interventions. And here's the Wells definition from the previous slide in a visual format. As you can see, it's a triangle, or if you prefer, maybe it's a pyramid, where one begins at the bottom, down here, and you work your way all the way up to the top to competence, or if you've been really good, up to proficiency. Okay, so it was quite a climb. The model is linear and categorical, meaning that it does not reflect degrees of each category, and it does not easily depict situations where skills might have decreased. For example, where one becomes involved with work in a different setting. Therefore, it could mislead practitioners into believing in the attainment of universal competence across all settings, when in reality competence has been reached in only one setting. So something more was needed. Something beyond cultural competence. Reflexivity is a new element introduced here, and although it is implicit in previous models and has been mentioned in the previous literature, it has arguably not been afforded its rightful place. In order to understand reflexivity, the first step is to understand ourselves. And reflexivity is about relationship and how we relate to not only the knowledge, but also to what it means and what it asks of us. As Kilcullen has noted, it is a complex process. And reflexivity is all these things. However, to give you an understanding, and while you're reading those, of what this concept is involving, I want to share a recent story with you. A few months ago, not long after I set out on my research journey, I participated in a webinar. And for me, it was a superb presentation, and I emailed the presenter to thank her and to tell her how much I got from what she shared with us. She very kindly replied and thanked me, but it was what she described next that changed my whole research direction. She said that cultural responsiveness is what we need to aim for because it is more dynamic than cultural competence. Now that for me was a light bulb moment, but her next comment convinced me that my research needed a major shift in its focus. She said via email that she had just received a very negative comment from another webinar participant via the chat function on Zoom. However, her response is what took me by surprise. Instead of looking to defend herself and her point of view and to justify her position, she said that she now needed to have some reflexivity concerning the critical comment. In other words, her first response was to seek to understand the meaning behind the comment and the perspective of the person who made the comment. So from my exchange of these emails with the presenter, I came to see just how important reflexivity is when viewed within the cultural responsiveness dynamic. And so, this became the model of cultural responsiveness. This model takes the shape of a circle, which has no beginning or end. It also has no hierarchy that suggests progression from a lower to a higher degree. One can begin in this cultural responsive dynamic at any point, or many points around the circle at the same time. The conceptual model in its circularity is an infinite object, which reminds us that the cultural responsiveness experience is always ongoing, and we never cease in our efforts to develop our cultural responsiveness and to extend our knowledge and understanding. The model also features bidirectional arrows. And arrows, as we know, point the way and give direction. Each arrow is labelled with the domains of culturally or cultural responsiveness that have emerged from a systematic review of the literature. The model is not binary in the sense that if I'm in one domain, I can't also be in another. And as already stated, it is possible to be in some or even all domains at the same time. Most previous models are linear and binary. They depict a journey from what some call incompetence to competence or even proficiency. This model, although it depicts movement, it is not characterized by a journey, but by what could be described as a dance between the reflexive self and the domains. It is believed that this model is the first to place reflexivity at the centre, and it also differs from previous models with its dimensional rather than categorical domains radiating outwards through the dimensions of minimal, low, moderate and high. In epistemology, the study of knowledge, reflexivity refers to circular relationships between cause and effect, especially as embedded in human belief structures. And according to the philosopher and critical theorist Michel Foucault, a reflective relationship is bidirectional, with both the cause and the effect affecting one another in a relationship in which neither can be assigned as causes or effects. Hence, this model has been called Foucault's oscillation, because he said there must be perpetual oscillation between the culture of the self and the culture of the other. Because there is no starting point, this model easily fits within a constructivist learning paradigm where people can engage with any domain around the circle based on prior learning or experience. Recall the theories of Vygotsky and Piaget from developmental psychology. Accordingly, the model is more dynamic than others because it remains in constant motion, responding to the varieties of lived experience, with the reflexive self at the centre as the driving force which propels the individual outwards in constant, ever-changing directions. So we now ask ourselves, what do these 9 domains around the circle of this model represent? Their definitions are now presented alphabetically and in no order of importance, and I'll leave you to read each slide for yourselves. I'll just highlight a couple of points along the way. Awareness and how attitudes and behaviours can impact on others. Cultural competencies, not to be confused with cultural competence or cultural competency, but these are the skills and the interventions, and can also include other skills, such as engaging a cultural mentor or a traditional healer. Cultural humility. That has the humility to accept that we haven't got all the answers and that we are prepared to reach out to others and learn more about the culture of others. Cultural respect, involving respect for beliefs and cultural heritage. Also the place of elders, Indigenous knowledge systems, governance, collectivist culture. Cultural safety. This is a term that came to us sometime in the late 80s from the Nursing Council of New Zealand, where it refers to our ability to reflect, there's that word again, on one's own identity, often with its legacy of inherited privilege and power. Inclusive relationships was a very strong message and recurring theme in the literature, looking at how we can work collaboratively with Indigenous people and also Indigenous communities, because let's face it, when you are working with Indigenous individuals, you're working with communities. Knowledge, not just knowledge that acquires information, but knowledge of self, knowledge which is insight type knowledge, and how we impact on in terms of our own values on others. Self-reflection, not to be confused with the reflexive self, but it's a domain in itself and comes from the literature again. This ability to be able to reflect on those areas of power and privilege. It also mentions awareness there too, so we can be in more than one domain at the same time. social justice, human rights, making sure that our work and our research also benefits Indigenous individuals and societies. That concludes my presentation today. Thank you for your attention. I trust that this model of cultural responsiveness can now offer a way forward for those among us who are in teaching and learning situations, or for those who are practitioners. Thank you.